First story. Prior to working at the present hospital, I was a nurse at a number of different clinics and hospitals. 30 minutes from my house was the geriatric hospital where I worked. This wasn't new to me. I had worked with elderly people in the past. You soon will see why I had only been employed by this facility for a few weeks. At this hospital, I was working my second to last shift. I started that night working graveyard shifts, without realizing that I was sleeping for negative hours. I was given the Alzheimer's ward assignment. This ward's patients loved me to pieces. I'm confident that as a young woman in her 20s, I brought a breath of new air to the ward's residents who would otherwise be left to ruminate in their heads on their own. Someone who could connect them to the present or the commonplace. You have the ability to mentally go to different places if you're by yourself. However, you are confined to that specific moment when someone else is in your area. That night, I was seeing a lot of patients, but one in particular seemed a little more agitated than the others. Lena was her name. It was my first night with her, and every time I went into her room, she would tell me about the voices she could not stop hearing and the black-clad figure she could not stop seeing in the corner of the space. Before my shift began, the other woman in her room asked for her curtain to be closed so that Lena would leave her alone. She was a kind woman who always had a grin on her face when I was around, but she was very forgetful and didn't say much. Lena remained awake until 11 p.m., despite the fact that I began my shift at around 9 p.m. She used to get scared whenever she summoned me into the room because she thought she was hearing voices and because there was a man in black standing in the corner of the room staring at her. To be honest, I felt a little uneasy about it. I think she was seeing and hearing these things in her head, and I felt bad for her because I thought they were really frightful. Nevertheless, I made every effort to soothe her and help her fall asleep. I wanted to be considerate of the other patient in the room, so I refrained from turning on the TV to help her relax. Lena was given a hug, and I reassured her that it was all right to breathe and unwind. I reassured her that I was always available and that she wasn't alone in this place. This appeared to be the solution. Lena unwinded for a bit, and when I returned to the room, she was fast asleep. The night moves considerably more slowly once most, if not all, of the patients are asleep. Time seems to go backwards. I heard something in the linen room an hour or two later as I was restocking my cart. It was a peaceful room, rather small. It was strange to hear another noise because I had the door closed as well. I spun around, saw nothing, and went on to filling my cart. I then sensed what felt like a hand resting on my shoulder. I jumped and yelled, looking over my shoulder, but nothing was there. The room was empty of people. Still, I was aware that I felt a big object essentially grip my shoulder. I briefly peeked my head outside in the hallway. Not a single other nurse in sight. Complete silence. All I could do was go back to what I was doing. I kept adding supplies to the cart until it was full. My heart was in my throat the moment I turned to face the door, causing me to fall to the ground and scream. A figure in all black was standing outside the door, grinning and peering through the glass. I could have woken the entire ward with my shouts. A few seconds later, the man vanished from view through the door's glass window. One of my other nurses came in to help me off the floor because I was crying when the door opened. I asked her whether she had seen the man in the black suit. We looked into every room in the ward, and her reaction was, "What man? There's no one else here." Nobody wearing black was present in the room. Lena must have been in a light slumber when my shouts woke her, because when I entered her room she began talking about the voices again, this time about my screams, which she was unaware were mine. She stared at me when I asked her if this man in black seemed like he was smiling, and her demeanor transformed to the most intense I'd seen her all day, and I saw her eyebrows point down. Her question, "How did you know?" made my heart skip a beat, even though it was still racing. The other nurses entered and attempted to calm her down as she continued to scream, saying, "Get me out of here, he's coming." That night I was moved to a different ward with a different patient, and I finally decided to leave early because I was so terrified. The next day I texted the chief nurse to let her know that I was traumatized by the event and that I didn't really want to be in that building any longer. I also said that this would be my last shift. I received the most cordial reply I could have asked for. I've never had any form of diagnosis or suffered with hallucinations of any kind. I know what happens when you don't get enough sleep, but this was extreme. The feeling of the hand on my shoulder and the image of the smiling man behind the glass door, matching the description a patient kept giving repeatedly. I'm not sure if my mind started playing tricks on me because of what Lena was telling me all night. Were two of those once-in-a-lifetime, inexplicable supernatural occurrences. I hope that it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Narrative 2. I had meningitis from germs 3 years ago. South Florida is where I call home. I don't know how or from whom I may have acquired it, as I don't think there was an outbreak or anything. I started experiencing severe headaches, dizziness, nausea, drowsiness, and an appetite loss. Still, I recognized something seriously wrong when the hallucinations began. My spouse was at work when I heard a child downstairs call out for Mom from where I was lying unwell. We are not parents. I forced myself out of bed and went to call my husband's name by looking down the stairs. He was at work, so of course he didn't respond. I returned to bed because the headache I was getting from standing up was too great. I heard a voice call from downstairs for the second time. I grabbed up the phone and dialed my husband, telling him over the phone that I felt I was hallucinating and that I was hearing a terrible child's voice from within the house. It said, "Hello?" After talking to me on the phone and realizing how upset I was, he left work early to take me to the hospital. I had to dash to the toilet to puke up while changing out of my pajamas, while I waited for him to get home. I heard a second voice coming from outside the restroom just as I was about to throw up. I was unable to hear whatever it might have said. Could I determine whether it was the same voice I heard? I was going crazy. My condition wasn't identified until I got to the hospital, and from what I'd heard, it could be fatal if left untreated. The doctor informed me that while the hallucinations were unusual, they were not unheard of. Not long after my husband and I arrived at the hospital, I received antibiotics via needle. The physician informed me that I was lucky to have been at the hospital right away since, had I delayed, there could have been potentially deadly consequences or long-term repercussions. My spouse spent a couple hours in the room with me. I was informed that due to the intensity of my symptoms, I would need to be there for many days to a week. My spouse had work the following day, so he left about 10 o'clock to get home. I was instructed by the nurse to give her a call if I had any problems. I fell asleep quite soon, even though I still felt like I was going to die. I started dreaming that my ex-husband was chatting to me while standing above my bed in the room. He was making deplorable remarks about my present spousey. He gave me a heat pat and expressed relief that I was all right, adding that he had arrived as soon as he saw my husband go. He went on a tirade about how much he hates my present spouse and wishes he were dead. He continued to stroke my forehead before turning to go. I'd rather not talk about how toxic and terrible our marriage was and why it ended, but I frequently have bad dreams about my ex-husband. I awoke feeling dizzy and sleepy, and I glanced around the room. My hospital bed had a chair drawn up in front of it, but nobody was in it. That wasn't the case when my spouse departed. Since it was still early in the evening, I went back to sleep. The nurse was in the room when I woke up the following morning. When I informed her about the strangely vivid dream I had, she said it wasn't a dream, and that my cousin had come to see me the previous evening. I informed her that none of my cousins reside in the state. David was my ex-husband. She said, "Well, someone who said they're your cousin David visited you late last night." Her expression had grown more serious. Following a more thorough explanation, the nurse called for a doctor, who informed me that the antibiotics might have produced delirium, which made it more difficult for me to distinguish between awake and sleep, which is why I was hearing David's words so clearly. When I told my husband what had transpired over the phone, she was understandably furious and worried. After work that night, he returned once more. However, I texted David that day to inquire how he knew I was in the hospital and to wonder what the hell he was thinking when he came to visit me. I texted him, but he didn't respond. I followed up with him, informing him that I had heard about his threats against my husband and that I would be calling the police. And a few minutes afterward, he replied, adding, "I never threatened your husband. I was just there to make sure you were all right after hearing what had happened. It sounds like you heard something while you slept." He didn't answer when I said, "Stay out of my life or I'll get police involved again." I never told my husband about the threats I had heard in my half-dreamed, groggy state after that, since I wasn't sure if they were true or not. It's likely that what I heard wasn't what was spoken, given the combination of the antibiotics and my strange auditory hallucinations from the day before. I might be mistaken, though. Next week, I was out of the hospital. Tale 3. On Tinder, I once matched with Francesca, a girl I'm still friends with. She exuded coolness from the start. She had red highlights in her hair, a sleeve of tattoos covering her left arm, and a profile that stated she enjoyed working out. She had a photo taken on the roof of this stylish building, which had a sick view. When I asked her where it was, she told me it was an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town that was really simple to enter and quite fun to explore at night. She claimed that although there is typically one police officer on duty at night to discourage trespassers, it is very simple to get around. She suggested that we go there together as a kind of first date, if you can use that term at all. I wholeheartedly agreed with that. I picked her up from her place 10 minutes away, and we drove the 20 minutes to the hospital. She seemed cool, and it sounded like a cool, unusual kind of approach to meet someone instead of the typical, "Let's get drinks." We had a great opportunity to spend those 20 minutes getting to know one another and becoming temporarily at ease with each other's personality. Upon arriving at the hospital, she directed me to park on a dead-end street that was obscured by dense shrubs. It would take me 5 minutes to walk to the hospital's interior. We leaped the small barricade that divided the parking lot of the hospital from the road and proceeded to run through the expansive area in the direction of the grass adjacent to the door that she claimed to always use. She showed us the way to the hospital's basement through this smashed window. I joined up for this, even though it seemed kind of scary. I knew I was going to rip my jeans on something, so I was glad I wore my jeans baggy like she advised. Our phones served as our flashlights, none of the special heavy-duty lights that we brought with us. She gave off the impression that she knew this entire facility, inside and out. She showed us the route to the upstairs stairwell. It was unsettling enough, I have to admit, to be alone in a place like this at night with only one other person, but I had no clue how scary it was going to grow. Francesca was chatting so loudly on the first floor that I felt like telling her to shut up. Her voice made me fear we might be discovered. There was a noise down the hallway that sounded like a door opening or closing. Something reverberated toward us along the hallway. She stopped talking after hearing it too. We turned off our headlamps and waited until I whispered to her, "Is it normal for others to be here?" She replied, "Sometimes, but not really." Abruptly, a loud bang sounded considerably closer to us now. Both of us scurried in the shadows. With my eyes barely open, I followed her. We made it back to the stairwell and turned on our lights and sprinted up the steps. We thought it was acceptable to resume speaking at a regular volume when we had risen a few levels. The strange thing was that there was no indication of another light in the passage, despite Francesca telling me that the cops never came in here, suggesting that other explorers may have been involved. No one walking in the dark would be normal. Then, from the exit stair shaft where we had just been, we heard noises reverberating. A figure was approaching from the stairs. Once more we jumbled. Declaring she knew where to go, she led the way. We ran through this building's maze-like structure for a few minutes. I was actually going crazy. It felt like someone was following us, and I wasn't sure if I would have preferred it to be the police. She guided us to this small outside area. We were, I suppose, on what you would call the rooftop of this level, not the topmost rooftop. To catch our breath, we paused. The whole feeling of being watched was ruining the atmosphere. Since she seemed to be the local expert, I looked to her for advice. After a short while, we were more at ease and entered the room through a broken window that was in the ceiling. She wanted to go down these long, narrow wooden boards that dropped 10 feet below us, so this portion was unnerving. This height might be dangerous for a fall, but I didn't want to appear like a... I trailed behind her down the hazy, lengthy wooden board until we reached the top of the pillar, where one board came to an end and another began. With our legs hanging over the side and our heads hung over the darkness below, we rested on this pillar to just relax and chat. I assumed we were alone because it was so eerie down there, but then I heard something below us. It sounded like footsteps. Whatever was inside had already been alerted to our presence, so we switched on our flashlights and pointed them downward. A 40-something man in black sweatpants and a black jacket was standing at the pillar directly below us, staring up at us. He waved us to come down, grinning, and said, "Come on down," in a deep, eerie voice. "Are you police?" I inquired. He smiled creepily, ignoring my query, as if he didn't hear me. "Come on down," he said. Terrified, Francesca and I stood up and began to cross the thin piece of wood again. I was more afraid of falling now than I'd been earlier. I had no idea what we would end up with that man. The man hurried through a door and out of the room below us as we were approximately halfway across. Without a doubt, he was going to try to capture us. We needed to move quickly. Having made it across, we attempted to flee, aware of the risk posed by the man. We heard footsteps marching down the stairs and the door a few levels above us open and bang shut as we were racing down the stairs in the hospital shaft on the other side. He had tracked us somehow. It felt like we were running for our lives as we were hauling ass. After regaining our footing on the first level, we dashed back to the hospital's other entrance. We returned to the lower level and ascended via the fractured window. I stepped out second, so the whole process of going through that window was terrifying because I was terrified. Someone might grab my legs at any second. However, I believe we had lost the man by then. After sprinting through the parking lot to reach my car, we locked the doors and took a moment to regain our composure. That was a real horror, but in some way, we bonded right away by helping each other get through it. After that, we left and stopped at a Wendy's to grab some lunch and gather our thoughts in the car. After spending an hour together just chatting, I dropped her off. I've remained in touch with Francesca throughout the years, and although we briefly pursued a sexual relationship, our relationship ultimately ended as close friends. Neither of us went back to the hospital in the future.